This is the jewel neckline that we looked at earlier in another lesson on stay stitching. You can see how smoothly the curve on this lies and the facing underneath it. And as we talked about with understitching, that's part of the reason, but also grading the seam and clipping the curves is an integral part of getting a curve to lie flat and smooth. And let's talk about that a little bit on this. This is the same neckline with our facing. I've got it all pinned, right sides together, and we're going to stitch it. But I wanted to mention a few things first before I go to the machine. And one of the things that I had mentioned earlier about stay stitching is for the sewer to be careful when you're coming around the curve and as you're straightening out your fabric, to just straighten it out. Resist the temptation to pull on it and tug, because again, you'll distort the dimension on it, and if you've done a good job fitting your pattern, you want the garment to reflect that. Okay, this has a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and so I'm positioning it under my foot. And I always like to start in just a hair from the beginning point and back stitch first. And that way I'm not going backwards and forwards 3 times over the fabric. It just cuts down the bulk. Stitching around. Don't stitch over your pins, it's not good for your machine. And if this were a smaller curve, I might tell you to shorten your stitch a little bit. If your machine has a feature with an auto pivot lift on the foot, that's kind of handy to have too for a smaller curve. And sometimes with smaller curves too, it's kind of nice to stop, raise the foot a little bit, let the fabric relax under the foot, just to keep it all positioned very nicely. And again, you can see that I am manipulating the fabric to go around in the curve, but not stretching it as I go along. Take a couple of back stitches, cut my fabric. Now, here's our seam all stitched. If the seam allowances weren't clipped and graded, you can see how the fabric would buckle badly and would never lie flat. And no matter how hard you pressed it or anything else, you'd never get that to lie flat. So let's look at how we get that to look perfect. I like to grade seams with pinking shears, and part of the reason is that because pinking shears make a zigzag on the edge of the fabric, it more or less blurs the line so that when you press it, you don't get a sharp impression coming through your fabric at all. And one of the things that you should know about grading seams is that you always want to grade the seam of the facing narrower than that of the garment itself. The edge of the garment fabric is what's going to show through. When you're grading your seams, you don't want to grade both of them together. You want to grade them at different widths, and the narrower one is always going to be your facing seam allowance. So I'm going to start with that, and the reason being is that that one is not going to be the one that might show through from the public side of the garment. Also, the zigzag of the pinking shears will blur those edges a little bit. So I am going to grade this down to about a scant 1/4 inch and just go around. And if you have any manual dexterity problems with pinking shears, because sometimes they can be a little bit heavier to work with than a regular pair of scissors, you can get a pinking edge on a rotary cutter to go around and do the same job. So I'm just going around. Again, it's that scant 1/4 inch on my facing. It's a little bit tougher to get through that double layer with the seam allowance. And I'm just going to finish up. So that's one seam allowance that's all pinked and graded. And now I'm going to grade the seam allowance of the garment public side itself. So that one I'm going to grade at just about 1/8 of an inch wider. Go around, grade that. Again, going over that little seam allowance. I think I'll give that a little extra clip right there. And this is looking pretty good. So we've got both of those graded. Now, even still with them graded, again, you won't get them to lie flat. So what's the next thing that we have to do? We have to clip the seams. And a lot of times, people will clip, again, through both layers simultaneously. And it is faster, but it really isn't the best way to clip. I like to stagger my clips in different places between the facing seam allowance and the garment seam allowance. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. I'll just go around, and the interval between the clipping varies depending on how steep a curve you're going around. And if you notice that when you turn your fabric, if it's still buckling a little bit, all you have to do is go back and add a few more clips here and there. I'm doing these about every 1.5 inches on this neckline, and I think it should be pretty good. And I'm clipping pretty close to that stitching line. Not all the way up to it, but pretty close. And then on the garment, again, I don't know, here's the clipping on the facing. So I'm going to start my clipping on the garment seam allowance and kind of go in between where the clips are on the facing seam allowance. And what this does is, if you have any little V's when you spread the fabric and turn it to press it, you won't have as deep an impression there from the right side of the garment. And again, if when you go to press it, you see that it's not lying flat, a few more clips should do the trick. Okay, so we're clipped and graded and ready to turn. And you can see already that even without pressing, that edge is going to lie nice and flat and smooth. What those clips do is they spread out and they allow that stitching line to relax as it's turned to the right side. So let's give this a press. And as you saw on the chapter with the understitching helps keep the facing on the inside of the garment, which is exactly where you want it to stay put. Just maneuvering this around just a little bit. But already, even without pressing the whole thing, you can see how smooth and nicely it's lying. And that's a function both of the clipping and the grading. I'm going to move my pinking shears out of the way, that'll help. And it's really kind of fun when you see how nicely all of these little tips and tricks work, and again, improve your sewing. So, let me just get this last edge. Now that my iron is really steaming, it's working very nicely. So there you have it. You can see what a huge difference clipping and grading makes. So let me just smooth this out one last time. I think I might have pressed a little crease into it. And there you have it, a very smooth, nicely flattened out edge.